Okay, so what is your last name? Can you spell it, please?
Last name is Diemler, Diemler.
And your first name and middle initial?
Stephen, Stephenc.
Alright, and where were you born, Stephen?
Here in Jefferson City,
Jeff City? Alright.
What year?
1955.
Alright. When did you become part of the military?
A week after I graduated from Elias, May 30th, 1973.
What branch of service were you a part of?
United States Marine Corps.
Alright, and was this your choice? Did you choose to enter the military? Were you drafted, or?
I did. I chose it. I grew up in with some Marine family history. My dad was a Marine, and his two brothers were Marines, and one of my uncles was killed in Korea.
Were you a volunteer?
Yes.
Why did you volunteer?
Well, kind of as I said before, it was kind of a family history thing. I didn't have any pressure on me to do it, but it's what I wanted to do.
What were the reasons for how long you served? Like, how long did you serve, and then why did you stay that long?
I was in for 4 years, from 1973 to 1977, and one of the reasons it was 4 years, I could have enlisted for less, but one of the reasons it was 4 years was the MOS, or the job that I chose in the Marine Corps, required 4 years.
Where were you trained?
At Marine Corps Recruit Depot, San Diego. That was the initial basic training.
And what was there anything happening in the world when you joined the military specifically? Anything big?
When I joined, I actually signed up on a 6-month delayed entry program, so I signed up in December of 1972. So at that time, Vietnam was technically still going on, but we were beginning to draw down and withdraw. And actually, by the time I went active duty, I think all the combat troops were withdrawn from Vietnam.
What do you remember most about your time in service?
I remember the discipline and as well as the camaraderie between Marines, which still holds today. Marines are kind of different from the other branches of the service in that once you're a Marine, there's a saying, once you're a Marine, once a Marine, always a Marine. And it's true, and I associate with Marines from all different eras, from World War II up through Iraqi freedom and Afghanistan. And we all have one thing in common, being Marines. And it doesn't matter when you were in, you're a Marine. And it's something that you'll always remember. It's something that you earned. You have to earn the title of United States Marine. And so you have that in common with everyone who's ever been a Marine. And you're expected to uphold the tradition when you go into the Marine Corps of every Marine that has come before you.
What qualities did you see in the Marines versus another corps? What drew you to the Marines?
Well, of course, the family history. And then, to me, and maybe it was just being around my family, but the Marine Corps was the best. They're the elite. And, of course, other branches of service may have a problem with that, but Marines are recognized as one of the best fighting forces in the world.
Do you ever get back together with the people you served with?
I have seen some of the people that I served with off and on, but like I said, I also associate with, we have here in Jeff City and across the country, organization called the Marine Corps League, which is made up of all Marines and what they call FMF corpsmen, which are Navy corpsmen who served with Marine infantry units. So they're very highly valued in the field.
And it's to my understanding that you were part of another force that went out of the country, and you had an interesting experience there. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yeah, after I got out of the Marine Corps, and I got out of the Marine Corps for a number of personal reasons. Didn't have anything to do with wanting to be, just wanting to get out. So anyway, I came back and I started school here at Lincoln University. And then in the summer between my junior and senior year, I went back to visit the unit that I worked with in the Marine Corps. And what I did in the Marine Corps, I was aviation radar tech, and I worked on long-range three-dimensional air search radar. So while I was there was a tech rep from the company that manufactures the radar, and I worked with him when I was in the Marine Corps. And he just kind of said, "Are you looking for a job?" I said, "Well, maybe. Depends on what it pays." And so I went to work for a division of ITT Corporation, and the initial assignment was to teach a class to the Kuwait Air Force. Kuwait Air Force, the country of Kuwait, had purchased the same radar system that I worked on for their air defense. And so the country of Kuwait had an agreement with the United States, and the United States agreed to provide technical support and training to the Kuwait Air Force. And that contract was through the Marine Corps. So I was actually on contract to the Marine Corps. And so I went to Kuwait in 1980 and taught a one-year course to the Kuwait Air Force on the radar. And when that course was over, they needed some people to stay on as advisors to the Kuwait Air Force, 2 guys. So I volunteered to do that, and I stayed on in Kuwait as a technical advisor to the Kuwait Air Force and Air Defense. And so that was in 1981 or so, and so I was there from 1981 until 1990. And I don't know if you guys remember what happened in 1990. That was Desert Storm. Okay, Iraq invaded Kuwait. I was in Kuwait working when Iraq invaded, and it was a situation where Iraq came into the country and overran the country within 6 hours. So there was nowhere to go. I first heard about it, the evening before the invasion. I was out in town, went to the store, and I saw a guy there, a military guy from the U.S. Embassy. And he just made the remark to me, which didn't mean much at the time. He said, "Tomorrow might be an interesting day at work." Okay. And he didn't say any more than that. And I don't know if that was classified. He had some inclination as to what was going to happen, apparently. But so anyway, that evening I can recall hearing jets go low over the house, which wasn't that unusual. And I worked with the Kuwait Air Force. I know they do night operations. It didn't mean a whole lot. But then about 6 o'clock in the morning, a friend of mine called from downtown Kuwait City. He lived downtown Kuwait City, and he called up and he said the Iraqis have invaded. He said there's shooting going on everywhere. And so I said, "Oh." So I called the other guy, and we had 2 advisors there. And fortunately, my family was with me there from about 1982 on. But they had come home to Jeff City for the summer. They always came home every summer because it's too hot and there's nothing to do in Kuwait during the summer. So anyway, they hadn't returned yet, so it was just me and the other guy and his wife. So I called him up. I said, "You're not going to believe this, but Iraq's invaded, and they're at least as far as downtown Kuwait City." We didn't know at the time. So I said, "We need to get in the car and go." So we got in the car, and he actually lived maybe half a mile away from me, but went over and picked him up, got in our car, and we headed on the main highway to Saudi Arabia. And we didn't get very far. We got stopped at a checkpoint set up by the Iraqi army, and there was this kid. He looked like one of you guys, and he had this big old rifle slung across on a sling. I mean, the rifle looked like he was almost as big as he was, but he spoke some English, and it was probably why he was put there. So at that time, they had just invaded. I'm sure the soldiers had no orders to do anything with Westerners or Americans. So he just told us. He says, you can't go. You must go back. Okay, so we turned around and we went back. And so I stayed at my house probably for the next 4 or 5 days. And then I decided to go over to my coworker's apartment, and so we stayed there. And while I was there, we were in contact with the U.S. Embassy. I was able, on the morning of the invasion, to make contact to call the company headquarters back in the U.S. and tell them, Iraq's invaded. We're going to try and get out, but we don't know. And then after that phone call, you couldn't make any more phone calls. And I tried to call home to my wife and everything, and I couldn't get through. I couldn't get out. So anyway, we're there and in contact with the embassy. And I actually went down to the embassy a couple times, and the Iraqi military didn't really bother me. I had some checkpoints to go through and everything. I had my passport, but they didn't bother me. And they had a list of Americans that they hadn't had contact with. So I knew some of them, and so I went out in town and tried to make contact with these people. One of their people at the embassy had left his radio at his house, and they didn't want the Iraqis to get the radio, so I went to the guy's house and picked it up. And other than that, we also we got in contact with a lady that was working in Kuwait for McDonnell Douglas. They manufacture the A4 Skyhawk fighter that Kuwait used. So she was working for McDonnell Douglas. She was there by herself. We went and picked her up and brought her to my friend's house. There were a lot of people that went to the embassy for shelter. And my coworker, who was also a Marine, we decided we weren't going to do that. We're not going to do that because we're just sitting ducks. The Iraqi army, when I'd been down there, had surrounded the embassy. They were there, so you were already captured. So we weren't going to do that. So we stayed in my friend's apartment and listened to the BBC every day, listened to Voice of America, trying to figure out what's going on. Is the U.S. going to do anything? And didn't appear that anything was going on right away. So my coworker's wife was South Korean, and so she had contact with the South Korean embassy, and they were organizing groups of people to try and escape out over the desert. And so we decided, well, I think, well, maybe we want to try that. And so she made contact, and we were going to go, I think maybe on a Monday, we were going to go on the next Wednesday, they were going to try and go out. Well, before that happened, apparently a group that they were leading out got fired on by the Iraqi army, and they actually threw a grenade at them, and so the South Korean embassy decided it was too dangerous. So then, probably a few days after that, this lady that worked for McDonnell Douglas, she had some friends who had friends who had friends who knew some Arab guy. They said he was a Bedouin. Bedouin people in Kuwait were not necessarily Kuwaiti citizens. They lived out in the desert. They just lived there. So they knew their way around the desert, but they weren't necessarily Kuwaitis. So anyway, they had this Arab Bedouin guy who was going to take people out over the desert. And so I said, okay, let's do it. So on the day that this is all scheduled, we're supposed to meet the guy, the Arab Bedouin guy, in front of the hospital in a little town that's a little bit south of Kuwait City called Ahmadi. And we're supposed to meet him at like 11 o'clock in the morning. So we get down there, and in front of Ahmadi Hospital, and there's like several SUVs parked along the street, and they're just packed to the hilt with belongings, and they're all lined up there. So it's kind of obvious maybe they're going to try and go someplace. And so we get there, and we get in actually at the end of the line and just park there, and the guy isn't there. He's not, and so we're waiting, and he's not there, and he's not there, and this Jeep with 4 Iraqi soldiers comes driving by and looks at us and looks at the convoy, but they don't stop. They go on by. And actually, I should say that in order to be part of this convoy, they wanted us to dress as much as we could as Arabs. So, or like the Kuwaitis would. And so, what the Arab men generally wore was what they call a distasha. And a distasha is, if you see film from that part of the country, you'll see it looked like a long white dress. Okay, so I was wearing a distasha, and the headdress that you see usually is called a gutra. And so I had the gutra. I had a red and white checked gutra, which I had tied kind of like you may see, like maybe Palestinian, to where only my eyes are showing. So I had it tied up. So anyway, they can't tell. The Iraqi soldiers just driving by really can't tell if we're Americans or not. So we sat there for 45 minutes waiting for this guide, and he's not showing up. And these soldiers keep driving by, the same Jeep with the Iraqi soldiers, and we thought, they're going to get us. But they never did stop. They just kept driving by, and then finally the guide shows up, and so we're off on the road, and we take off on the road, and it wasn't too long after we got on the road, and it's a divided highway. It's a modern highway, and so we're heading south to Saudi Arabia, and so now this is almost 2 weeks into the invasion. So there was no checkpoint like we ran into the first day. Don't know why. Maybe they think they had it secured or whatever. I don't know. But we're going down the highway. However, this military suburban with Iraqi soldiers come flying past us and cuts off the lead car. Well, as he cuts off the lead car, 4 or 5 of the lead cars take off into the desert, and there were a total of 13 vehicles, mostly SUVs, in the convoy. So 4 or 5 of them head off into the desert and take off, and the rest of us stop, and because they had, come and cut us off, and a bunch of Iraqi soldiers jump out of the SUV, and they've all got us at gunpoint. So again, we think, they've got us. And so we're just sitting there, and they're yelling at us and just standing there, and nobody's getting out of the cars or anything, so I didn't get out of the car. And so we're just sitting there, and probably 15, 20 minutes later, while the Suburban took off, a bunch of soldiers jumped out, the Suburban took off after the ones that went out in the desert. Probably 15, 20 minutes later, they all come back. And so the Bedouin guide and a couple of the Kuwaitis in this convoy, and the convoy was made up pretty much all Kuwaitis, except for 2 vehicles that I was with, and there was 5 of us that were Westerners. So anyway, the Kuwaiti guys, Arab Bedouin guy, talked to the soldiers, and then they jump back in the cars, and as they're going by me, one of them rolled down the window, and he spoke English. He knew that we were Westerners. He said, "Just follow us, follow us." So we turned around, we head back towards Kuwait City. And for whatever reason, the Suburban with the Iraqi soldiers didn't follow us. So we're heading back to Kuwait City on the highway, and probably just as soon as we were out of sight of that Suburban back there, the Bedouin guy takes off into the desert. And so we all follow him into the desert. And so there's no highway. He must know where he's going. I don't know where he's going. I know the general direction he's going. I know he's going towards Saudi Arabia, but it's probably about, from that point, I would say it was at least 55, 60 miles to Saudi Arabia. So we're heading off into the desert, and we're just going, we're probably doing 70 miles an hour across the sand in the desert. And so I'm keeping up with everybody in the convoy, but I can see in the distance, I start to see all these little dots, and they just look like dots. Pretty much as far as I can see from one way to the other, and we're just heading towards them. And as we get even closer, I could tell what they were. They were tanks. They were Iraqi tanks that were buried in the sand up to the turret, so that just the top turret and the gun are kind of sticking out. And they're all pointed south to Saudi Arabia because, of course, they're anticipating some attack from that direction. But anyway, there's 3 echelons of them, 3 rows of these tanks, and they're just from one horizon to the other. And we just went right through between 2 of them, and they probably weren't spaced more than from this wall to that wall over there. And we just went right between them. And so there's these Iraqi soldiers sitting on their tanks out there, not doing a whole lot, but here come these cars between them. And I thought, okay, great, now we're going to get blown up, we're going to get shot. They're just going to start shooting at us, but didn't happen. That was the worst, one of the worst parts of the whole thing, because I'm just, driving, but we get maybe a mile on the other side of the tanks, and the guide stops. And he does, and they come back. One of the guys up there that speaks English came back, and he said, "Just wait here." He says, "We're missing somebody. We're missing a car. We're going to go back and get it." So two vehicles, the Arab Bedouin guy and another Kuwaiti guy and 2 or 3 other Kuwaitis went back towards the tanks. So we sat there, and now while I'm looking around, I can see vehicles of some kind driving off in the distance, and there are several this way, this way. So they've got it, it's got to be Iraqi army out there. And so we're just sitting there. And again, it's one of those, they're going to get us. But we sat there 45 minutes, and finally they showed back up and said, come on, let's go. And so we went off, and it was probably another 20 minutes, and in the distance I see a flag, but then you get closer and I see it's the green Saudi flag. So the guide took us to a border crossing that would have been, I think, about maybe 5-10 miles west of a Saudi town called Khafji. And if you look on the map, you'll find Khafji. And so this border crossing was there, and we stopped there, and the Saudi soldiers that were manning the post, all greeted us, and I just, we made it, and I just wanted to keep going, but they insisted we stay and served us a meal, and so the guy that had gone with the Bedouin guy back there, he came and talked to me and said, this is what happened. He said, one of the cars got stuck right between the tanks. And so they went back, and the Iraqi soldiers actually helped them dig this car out. And the Iraqi soldiers that they talked with, of course, these are Kuwaitis, they're Arabs talking to Iraqi, who are also Arabs. And so the Iraqi soldiers told these guys, they said, this Saddam guy, he's crazy. He says, we don't want to be here. He said, if you want to go, we don't care. Because they, apparently they didn't have any orders at that time to stop anybody. I think those orders came down later to where they weren't letting anybody. But, so we were fortunate in that the Iraqi soldiers had that attitude. And to tell you the truth, I think a lot of the Iraqi soldiers had that same attitude. And so when the U.S. And the coalition eventually invaded Kuwait, there wasn't a whole lot of resistance because they didn't want to fight. They didn't really want to be there. And so got to Khafji. We went over to Khafji, and I was able to make a phone call to my wife and said, we made it, we're here. Got out, and when we were also there, we were one of the first. There may have been another group that got out before us, but we were maybe the second group that got out. And so there was a photographer there from the Associated Press, and our picture actually ended up in Time magazine for that week. We went down, we drove from Khafji south along the Saudi Arabian coast and crossed over to an island. It's an island nation called Bahrain. Don't know if you've ever heard of it. But we crossed over to Bahrain, and then one of the people traveling with us actually also worked for Associated Press. So through Associated Press, she made arrangements for us for a hotel, made arrangements to get our flights out and back to the States. So we were pretty much taken care of. And when I got back flew into St. Louis, my wife was there waiting, and also a St. Louis TV station. And the St. Louis TV station flew us on their news helicopter back to Jeff City and actually landed the helicopter right next to my parents' house, in the field next to my parents' house. And of course all the local TV and everything was waiting for us when we got there. And my wife and I were on Good Morning America the next morning from my parents' house. One of the TV stations, I guess they were broadcasting it live or something, or on the radio, I don't know, but you know, when we got in there, they asked me, well, what's the first thing you want to do? And I said, I'd like to have a Greaseria pizza. And at that time, Greaseria, well, before I left, everybody knew that Greaseria was Pizzeria Napolitana. Now, it wasn't meant to be derogatory, it's just what we called it. But they knew, because nobody ordered it, but it wasn't probably half an hour later, they showed up at the door, at my parents' door, with the pizzas. So, but anyway, that's my story, and it's kind of related to the Marine Corps because, number one, I was there doing stuff that I did in the Marine Corps. I was on contract to the Marine Corps doing this stuff, and it was my training in the Marine Corps that caused me not to panic, to assess the situation, and come up with a plan to get out. Marines have a saying called improvise, adapt, and overcome. When you're faced with the situation, you assess the situation, you improvise, you adapt, and you execute, overcome the obstacle. That's what we do.
So one last, to wrap up here, if you could do it all again, would you do it?
If I could go back to Kuwait today, I would. I enjoyed the work, I enjoyed the people. It was great.
All right.
Until August 2nd, 1990.
All right, well, thank you for your time today, and thank you for coming in.
Okay, welcome.